Good morning, everybody. It is Thursday, March 3rd, and there's a lot going on in the world. Welcome to our weekly debrief where we take a little time to look at the news over coffee, hopefully with friends, to dig a little deeper on some of the headlines that you're likely seeing throughout this week. And here we are, a week really into the war in Ukraine. Last week, we were even struggling to really understand what is the right words to use. Words really matter. Is it an invasion? Is it an attack? Is it a war? What constitutes all of this? How do you define it? And so I'm going to call it a war because that's what we're seeing on the ground. This is what we're seeing in the ground in Ukraine, a Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia is calling it a special operation. And one of the things I learned in my reporting this week is that apparently on the Russian search engine, so we have Google, obviously, here in the United States and others that you can use, but apparently the word war, you're not able to actually look up. You're not able to actually use that term to describe what's happening in Ukraine. It's a special operation. I relied on that information from author and journalist David Satter, who we talked to for the first time last week. We have a second interview with him coming up that will be released tomorrow, where we dig even deeper. And one of the reasons why I really like to talk to David is not just because of his experience working in the Soviet Union and watching the collapse of it, working throughout the Cold War, but it is also because of his language. He speaks and reads and writes in Russian. I don't do that. And quite frankly, probably a lot of people that you're watching reporting on the news right now do not. And it's really important to break down some of those language barriers to know what's happening. So he shared that with me. I thought that was an interesting fact. What I thought we would do today is take some of your questions, but also take what would seem like simple storylines and pull on these threads a little bit and unravel how very simple things can really impact the story moving forward. The big news this morning is that it seems at this point, and quite frankly, information has been back and forth on this for the past 12 hours, a city in the south of Ukraine has fallen. That would be the first city to fall to Russian forces. And the name of that city is Kherson. Several of you have asked about that. Amy, you were asking what constitutes a fallen city. Why do we use that term fallen city? Many of you had that question. And it's really interesting to pause because we use that so freely. When we say a city has fallen, we're saying that whoever was the local government is no longer in charge. The city has fallen to now Russian invaders, the Russian military. So the city is no longer under the control of the Ukrainian government in any way. It would be under the control of Russia and the Russian military. Now that leads to a lot of different questions. What is the state of life there? I mean, the city is likely not functioning in any capacity right now. And the question moving forward for the next several weeks and months, if we do see more cities fall to Russian forces, well, who's running the city? There's some very basic things, again, pulling on some simple threads. What about the water department? What about electricity? What about some very basic things that cities have? When a city has fallen, it means that the city in its former self or its former sense is no longer. It's no longer under the control of the local government. So we can use this term in a lot of ways. We've used it in Syria and Iraq. In Afghanistan, a city can fall to the Taliban. Remember, we talked about that. Afghanistan falling to the Taliban, no longer under the Afghanistan government, but under Taliban control. So I want to show you a little bit of the map. We're going to go to the map as we usually do. I love looking at maps. Never have loved looking at maps as much as I have over the last year because it's helpful to orient us. I don't know about you. I've never been to Ukraine. And I think it's really important to look at a map and get an understanding of where everything is. But before we jump into that, a couple things, housekeeping items. Number one, if you're watching live on Instagram, we put out badges. So at the very bottom, if you'd like to send us a tip, like dropping a quarter in the tip jar at a coffee shop, you can do that. If you're watching later, just want to encourage you on our quick link section on Instagram in our bio or even on our website. You can go to Support Smarter News, and it's a way for us that we keep our funding up so I can support teams that actually are now around the world. So thank you so much in advance for that. Just want to flag that for you. And the other thing I want to tell you is remember that all of our information, because I do get nervous, there's a lot of new people, a lot of new faces here. I even was jumping on to try to record this live. I couldn't get a connection from Instagram. It kept telling me that there's no connection, even though I have Wi-Fi and cellular services and all the good stuff. So because we're in this time when we don't, you could really quickly suddenly not have an Instagram account that's functioning. Just remember that everything that we do here, including all our interviews, all the reports are put on our website as well. And you can even save our website to your home screen and it can function like an app for you. So if you like a little break from social media, that's also a great thing just to realize. So let me start with a story. We're going to start at what feels like a tangent, but I'm going to pull it in. Because have you guys seen these headlines? And we'll kind of start lighter because it's been a heavy news cycle. Let's start a little bit lighter. Have you seen these headlines about states in America banning Russian vodka sales? Have you seen this? It's a real thing. It's not just, bartenders that are like, I'm not serving Russian vodka. The states are actually banning the sale of Russian vodka to support Ukraine. It's all over the country. Oregon, New Hampshire, North Carolina, West Virginia. This is according to the Wall Street Journal. What's interesting to note about this, in case that's just something that you're interested in, that less than 2%, in fact, just over 1% of any of the vodka imported to America has ties to Russia. So even though we associate vodka with Russia, most of the vodka that you're drinking, if you're drinking at all at this time, hopefully not at this moment, it's 10 o'clock Central Time in Texas, but I'm not here to judge, is not coming from Russia. So a lot of the brands, though, are at least have connections to Eastern Europe. So I was checking this out. I thought this was very interesting. I didn't really know that much about vodka. And I thought, well, this is sort of an interesting thing to learn about. So I saw that the Stoli is a very famous what we think is a Russian vodka. It's not Russian vodka. It's actually from Latvia. Latvia is bordering Belarus and is a NATO member, by the way. And there was an early report this week that Stoli even though most of its operations are in Latvia and Ukraine, they found that some wheat was actually coming from Russian farmers and that they were going to stop that. On their website, just about 24 hours ago, there was a statement from the person that's in charge of this large alcohol group that owns Stoli. And it was a very interesting statement about how Stoli stands with the Ukrainians, and he himself knows what it's like to basically be oppressed by Russia. Why is that? He's a very, very powerful businessman, and he's a billionaire. And he bought this large alcohol group back when Russia was emerging from the Soviet Union, got into a tiff with the Russian government and was expelled. Now, I don't know all the details about this, but just taking it one step further, Stoli is actually the group overall is the group that actually bought the vineyard that Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt own in France. I don't know how all these things are connected, but it's sort of an interesting thing, right? You have like just the will of people to just want to do something to show support for Ukraine. So what's an easy thing that you associate with Russia? Okay, we're going to cut off Russian vodka, even though there's not that much Russian vodka. And apparently, if you have a bottle of Russian vodka, people are just putting it to the side because no one really knows what to do with it at this point. But I thought that was also interesting just to note that so much of vodka production actually isn't tied to Russia at all, at least not in the United States. And some of the people that are running these large vodka companies or alcohol companies actually have had an experience in Russia that highlight some of the challenges of trying to do any sort of business with Russia or any sort of diplomacy. Now, if we really wanted to affect Russia and the Russian economy, vodka is not where we would start. It would be fuel. And we know that because Russia is a major exporter of oil and gas, not only to Europe, but also to the United States. What's important to know here, though, is that most of the oil that we import into the United States is not from Russia. And that's also key. Most of it's actually from Canada and also from Mexico. And yes, Saudi Arabia is in there too, but not as much as you might think. So that's why there's so much pressure right now on the Biden administration and quite frankly, others. Hey, if you really want to hurt Russia, if you really, really want to do that, then we got to call a full embargo over any of this oil and gas coming from Russia. Now, why wouldn't we do that? Because the oil markets are volatile. This is I'm not justifying it. I'm just explaining. Oil markets are really volatile. And even just the sense of something happening can affect prices. And that's one of the reasons why you've seen a large spike in prices when it comes to oil. We often associate the oil markets with gasoline, right? That's going to affect the gas prices, which affects me if I have a car. But also, if I don't have a car, I live in a big city, I use public transportation, it affects my Amazon driver, for example. And the prices get pushed in to an already tense economy where we have a lot of inflation. And that can add to more inflation and more price rises. And that slows down the American consumer. The American consumer is the number one consumer in the world and the largest economy in the world. We slow down, then what starts to happen? The world economy starts to slow down. So that has a lot of ripple effects. But I also want you to think about this. A couple of years ago, well, much longer than a couple of years ago, I interviewed a shoe designer by the name of Stuart Weitzman. famous brands out there. You probably have seen his shops around. And there's a real Stuart Weitzman, and he has a really interesting story. And one of the things we talked about at the time was how oil prices impacted him, because it wasn't just about all it takes to get a shoe made and then delivered somewhere, but even things like the petroleum products that are a part of your sole of your shoe, rubber, plastic, petroleum products that are in makeup. I mean, we're all in this clean makeup trend, right? But these petroleum products are in a lot of things that we don't even think about. So this is another reason why there's a hesitancy to disrupt the oil market too much. Now, whether or not we could see an embargo, if you ever saw any headlines about that, it would be really significant. And even just the whisper of it could be significant and powerful, by the way. Sometimes it's not even about the action, it's the anticipation of it. So that's something to watch, but just an idea of vodka versus oil as you go into your weekend. Let me go ahead and show you the map here. I want to show you what's going on in Ukraine at this exact moment from what we know and best we can. I was listening to the Pentagon press briefing yesterday. Oh, shoot, this isn't going to be it's not going to be bad. It's a broad map in case you're not watching us, you're listening to us on our podcast, but you can do this as well. I'll be able to explain it to you because what we're looking at is the map of Ukraine, and what we're really paying close attention to is this city Kherson in the bottom of Ukraine. One thing of note, I've been listening to a lot of Pentagon briefings, and that's for a couple reasons. One, the information coming out of Ukraine isn't consistent or really, quite frankly, that reliable. It's really great to have social media. We understand, we can even hear from the Ukrainian president. We can hear from the Russian foreign ministry. But what's actually happening on the ground is harder to determine. And even when the Pentagon may not have all the information, at least we know what is the information that the United States is willing to share on this particular topic. The Pentagon press briefings are run by the press secretary there, John Kirby, who's been around Washington, D.C. a lot. Of all the different press secretaries, I actually enjoy listening to him most. And just a little background as a journalist, there's press secretaries that will step to the microphone and all they're going to do for an hour is to try to avoid answering journalist questions. I find John Kirby is certainly representing the Defense Department and the United States of America, and he's definitely not going to answer a question that he doesn't want to. But he actually tries to provide information during his press briefings, and I appreciate that as a journalist. I don't love seeing on our website that I have so many quotes from him over the last couple of days. It reminds me, though, about what happened when we were seeing the withdrawal in Afghanistan. I like quoting American officials. I think that's important. I want to mix in other voices, but we're in this sort of breaking news environment where the reliable voices are very difficult to determine. So if I have to make a choice, I rather prioritize at least a government official that is at least sharing some of what America's thinking is. So I want to share that with you based on what he had to say. So if you take a look at the map of Ukraine, you see Crimea at the bottom. Russia has annexed Crimea, meaning that they have taken it over. In the past, I guess you could say that Crimea fell to Russian forces. But remember along the east, and if we can kind of extend this map over to the south and the east of Ukraine, you're looking at areas that have closer Russian ties than, let's say, Kyiv, or the cities that are in the west that are closer to Europe. You may have more Russian nationals, you may have more Russian speakers. So yes, they're living in Ukraine, but they have very close ties to Russia. Because why? Because Ukraine was a former Soviet state. We have families that we know that are living, some are living in Ukraine and some are living in Russia. They share the same background. They share the same blood. They have the same history. And so along this southern part of Ukraine and along the east, this is more about what that population is like versus the western part of Ukraine. Now, Kherson is an important port city. Crimea is important. Ukraine has never fully said to Russia, oh yeah, you have Crimea. But Crimea has been under control of Russia since 2014, since the last invasion. And that's been one of the questions about whether or not, as part of any sort of diplomatic efforts, if Ukraine could officially say, okay, Russia, you have Crimea, whether or not that would be a bartering chip, perhaps. But we don't really know. By the way, the talks between Russian and Ukrainian officials are ongoing at this time. So we'll see if there's any sort of inroads being made. But Kherson is important because it's a port city. We know the Black Sea is important because the Black Sea, if we extend the map further, there's actually a strait that goes out through Turkey to the broader ocean. So this is an important shipping channel for this part of the world, especially for the Russian Navy. And so there was the question about whether or not Kherson was able to hold on to Ukrainian resistance. According to reports and officials that are talking to the Associated Press, the city has fallen, is now under Russian control. Mariupol, which is slightly to the east of Kherson, is another large port city. This is also another city that we should watch over the next 24, 48 hours, because what we might see now by Russia is a focus on the south. The Pentagon said yesterday that when we're looking at resistance by Ukrainians, the Ukrainians have been, in the words of the Pentagon, creative and have made a difference in how Russia is approaching this fight. But in the south, that there's less resistance. Not that there's no fighting, but you're not looking at the huge population centers the same way that you're looking at Kyiv. You know, Kyiv is a city of several million people. Kherson has a population of a few 100,000. So you're looking at something different. You're looking at different terrain. You're also looking at different Russian supports because of the Russian Navy. So it's a different situation. There seemed to be concern from the Pentagon, and I'm categorizing that based on listening to the briefing about what's happening in the south of Ukraine, and also going up the east coast of Ukraine, because we have another really large city, the second largest city of Kharkiv, right near the border of Russia, a city of more than 1 million people, about the size of San Antonio, San Diego by population. And so here's what the Pentagon says. There's 3 different routes that Russia's taken. They're going from Belarus down into Kyiv. This is the area where we're talking about that convoy, miles and miles along of tanks. And at this point yesterday, it wasn't a lot of movement there. The movement was more in the south. So you have the Russians coming from Belarus down to Kyiv. You have the Russians coming up from the south, and then you have them coming from the east, from Russia into Ukraine. The meeting point by the Pentagon, they believe, is a route of all those different directions into Kyiv. Because if Kyiv falls to Russian forces, then the Ukrainian government is no longer in charge of the capital, and that would be symbolic for no longer having a handle on the nation. This is why we're watching this very closely. Now, there is a concern about sustenance and sustainment. This is the term by the Pentagon, sustainment. What happens when you take a road trip? These are the simple things that I was talking to you about at the beginning of all this. What happens when you're going on a road trip with your family? What are you thinking about? What do you actually need? Let's say the road trip is a couple hours long. I'll tell you what I'm thinking about. I'm wondering where we're going to use the bathroom, what sort of snacks we have, and what about gas? Because if I'm driving in an area that's pretty rural, I don't know where all the gas stations are. I have to kind of think about that. I can't run out of gas in the middle of nowhere with 3 kids in the back of the car. That's not going to do me well. And so this is the same thing that militaries actually have to consider, because they cannot just suddenly show up at a gas station and fill up. Now, Russian tanks, depending on what the vehicles are, some tanks can actually fill up on diesel fuel. So they could drive up to a gas station, but commonly they would have refueling trucks. Remember, when we were looking at sort of the buildup along the border of Ukraine, there was a question about not only when the tanks would move, but when the support vehicles would. Most of the military, based on my reporting over the last couple of weeks, I was able to speak to some folks that actually have commanded tanks before. Most of the military is actually not about the forward-leaning forces. It's about everybody that's doing everything else. You need medics. You need food. You need fuel. And you're not driving tanks for that. You might be driving a truck. You might be driving something real big. But that's why, if you remember, and you might recall back in Iraq, we'd talk about U.S. convoys being hit, supply trucks being hit by IEDs. This was part of the difficulty of the Iraq war, is that you need supplies. You need to get supplies place to place. And these were why these particular trucks could be targeted. The same thing, this is the same issue. Sustainment is the issue that the Pentagon says Russia is having. Because as this goes on, they have to figure out, the Russian military has to figure out, how do we feed these guys? How do we fuel these tanks? You just can't sit, it's cold. You can't just sit out there. How long can you sit out there in the cold? How do you get from point A to point B? What happens if you've been running these tanks for a while? Do they all have gas right now? It sounds really basic, but this is part of the story that we have to pay really close attention to. Because some of those issues, those logistic issues, and what the Pentagon said is integration and coordination is something that they're watching from the Russian military, because clearly that's a challenge and an obstacle for them at this exact moment. So that's something that we should watch too. As the days go on, there's a question, why isn't this convoy moving? Well, has the convoy figured out how to get the fuel? What if they get to Kyiv, but they run out of fuel in Kyiv? That's no good. So again, it's very basic things. Now, the same is said for the Ukrainians. The same as, I actually emailed Ina. Ina Sovsun is the parliament member that we were able to interview yesterday. She's a mother, she's a professor, and I emailed her last night and trying to keep close in contact with her. She's okay. She's in Kyiv right now. I asked her, I said, well, what about food supplies for people? We know people are going out to grocery stores. We've actually seen some pretty long lines. I think I have a picture here. Try to pull it up for you. Long lines at grocery stores. What about supplies, like simple food and just being able to go in and get what you need? And she said it's getting more difficult. It's getting more difficult in Ukraine. Again, another potential, I don't want to say bartering chip, but in talks, this is one grocery store in Kyiv. You could see that there's not a lot of supplies there. Is can we create humanitarian routes in Ukraine while this battle is ongoing to try to get people food and fuel and some of the basic things in life? That pressure on both the Ukrainians and the Russians is going to mount as the days go on. And again, very basic things. Do you have water? Do you have fuel? Do you have food? Let alone, do you have the will? And that's a question that one of you asked, which I thought was really interesting. Pam, you said, is it true that the captured Russian soldiers are allowed to call their mothers? Interesting fact. So I was speaking to Ina yesterday, and I was also speaking to David Satter, doing some reporting. We just assume that everybody has a phone, right? I mean, we're seeing so many images come from Ukraine. So most people have phones, right? Well, that's also becoming an issue. Cellular service, electricity is also becoming an issue, especially in the South. We should be aware of that. But according to reports, the Russian soldiers, and Ina actually said this yesterday, she said the Russian soldiers do not have phones. And according to David, that's very typical of Russian forces to take away that. I don't know what I would assume about that. But apparently they don't. They don't necessarily have their phones. There's been a text message that was read by the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations of a Russian soldier and his mother and exchanges. Again, that's the Ukrainians putting forward that message. It was a really sad text exchange about a soldier that was expressing he didn't know why he was in Ukraine and his mother being concerned about him. Again, difficult to verify. But one of the things that seems to have emerged is that that the soldiers don't actually have their phones and they're not actually communicating necessarily back to Russia or with their families. That's another side of the story to watch, because as the weeks go on, the questions will emerge about, well, where is my son? And one of the things that we're going to be watching is pressure inside of Russia on the Russian regime that's currently in power about what's actually happening in Ukraine. Is it a special operation to denazification? I can't even say the word. I mean, have you ever used that word in your life? I've never used that, ever. Denazification of Ukraine. That's the Russians' purpose, they say, for being in Ukraine. A special operation, not a war. But the Ukrainians, to their credit, have been very aggressive on social media, sharing images that are going all around the world, and also setting up a website so that Russian mothers could look and identify their sons. I mean, this is modern warfare that we're seeing. And the question of the impact of, again, a simple thing, a cell phone, is also part of this. If we start to lose cell service, we lose Wi-Fi, we're no longer to get communication inside of Ukraine, that would be bad. We don't want that. Right now, those images are helping the world's attention stay on Ukraine. And no matter how annoyed we feel about our cell phones on a regular basis, this is a major change from 2014 even. 2014, all of us likely had cell phones, but it was different. It wasn't the same. The social media wasn't as prolific. We weren't coming out of a pandemic where we've been on our phone. We're now at this habit of being on the phone so much to stay connected. So again, simple things that are really impacting what we're going to see over the next several days. So it's not just about understanding what is the larger academic thinking of what Vladimir Putin is going to do. And I mean, all of this is important. What is our nuclear policy? All of that's important. Some of these basic things and just paying attention to that. Do we have all these? Do we have electricity? Do we have running water? Do we have fuel? These are going to be one of the major parts of the story that I'm going to watch going into the next week. Pam was asking, actually Stephanie was asking, what would it mean for Ukraine to become part of the EU? Great question. Interesting. So, and big shout out to one of my colleagues, Leah, who did a bunch of research on this week, because we had an idea of EU membership. We've talked a lot about NATO membership. NATO is a defense alliance. The EU was really born out of an economic alliance as a way to prevent conflict. Hey, the closer that we're economically tied, the less motivation we're going to have to fight with each other. This was part of the thinking of the European Union that sort of dates back to the 1950s, the thinking about it and the first iteration of where we're at right now. What Leah looked at yesterday, because we were very curious, what is the average time it takes for a country to join the European Union? And there's, different, depending on your country, your line from saying, I'd like to join the EU to actually becoming a part of the EU varies. It could be several years to more than a decade. So the average time it takes is 8 years. So although you have noticed the Ukrainian president make that application, we saw a picture and video of him and an appeal to the European Union to join. Typically, that would not be fast-tracked. And even if it was fast-tracked, think about that. There's different qualifications. You have to agree to your nation actually is supposed to vote on it as well to say that yes, we as a people want to join the European Union. So it's not an easy thing to do. The benefit of that would be that there would be a closer economic alliance between Ukraine and the rest of the European Union, but really it'd be largely symbolic of, hey, we're part of Western Europe. We're actually not part of this Eastern bloc of countries that are trying to make up their mind about who they have alignment with. We're going to align ourselves to Western Europe and quote unquote the West. There's also a security part of the European Union. It's not the same as NATO. So NATO has that collective defense part of it, which is basically how I would feel about you. If someone's picking on you, I'm going to come to your defense. I'm not going to really ask that many questions. I got your back. The European Union it is a promise of support. So not as strong as NATO, and not all European Union countries are actually NATO members. So there's some that are both, there's some that are one and the other, and that's sort of an interesting fact to know as well. So quick questions. Anybody else would like any questions this morning? I'm happy to share with you any other things that you'd like to talk a little bit about. Some of you are talking about Elon Musk, and this is an interesting side story. Have you heard about this? Elon Musk apparently has this project. Again, super broad strokes here. To say Elon Musk has a project is like an understatement of the century. By the way, he has many projects, actually. Part of this project is to set up satellites that would provide Wi-Fi connectivity in places that it's very difficult to get. By the way, there's many places in the United States that don't have great connectivity. So, it's not just a third world country or an emergency situation like we're seeing in Ukraine. But the Pentagon was asked about Elon Musk setting up these satellites for, I believe it's Starlink. Do I have that right? I'm going to just double check. Just to say, hey, are you aware that Elon Musk might be doing this? Is he doing this with any sort of agreement or approval with the U.S. government? Yes, Starlink satellites. And the Pentagon said no, that they don't really have anything to add on that. So sort of an interesting. There's a lot of interesting storylines emerging, though, that are suggesting how sort of your average person is trying to figure out ways to help. I mean, if you come full circle, that's what the vodka thing is all about. It's not, I'm sure no one's thinking that's really going to give it to the Russians, but it's symbolic. It's about how can we actually help here in a situation that is so horrendous, quite frankly. Interesting question here. Any news on China's involvement? Now, interesting about China. I know we've been so focused on Eastern Europe. I've been paying close attention to China, and I actually have an interview later on today that I'm going to hopefully get a little more background information to share with you. What's been happening over the last couple of days in China and Taiwan is significant. Taiwan, which is a country that China does not, pardon me, the United States would not call it a country. We have this, I'm laughing because it's like we do word acrobatics to try to explain our relationship with Taiwan, which we want to support Taiwan, but we fall short of calling it an independent nation because that would bother China. China doesn't consider Taiwan independent. But for our purposes, Taiwan is an independent entity. And we have sent a delegation of very high-ranking officials to Taiwan at this exact moment. People like former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo under the Trump administration, former Joint Chiefs Chairman Mike Mullen under under Bush and Obama. So bipartisan group, high-ranking people that are in Taiwan right now to show support for Taiwan, because the concern is that China watching Russia could try to do the same thing to Taiwan. There's always this question about, will China try to invade Taiwan and take it as part of its fold, annex it and say it's theirs? So we have some very important people on the ground in Taiwan right now. There's been a massive power outage over the last 12 hours there. That's been somewhat mysterious. We don't know the cause of it yet. There's been all sorts of theories about whether or not China could be behind that. We don't know. There also could just be a power outage, because that can happen as well. And that's actually happened in Taiwan over the last year. But there's also reports that the Chinese Navy has come closer to Taiwan than it has in recent years. We also know that the Chinese military likes to fly planes very close to what would be considered Taiwan's airspace. And so that provocative action is happening in Taiwan, and we can't lose sight of that as well. A conflict between Russia and the United States and the rest of the world happening right now is disruptive. A conflict that's happening between the United States and the rest of the world in China and Taiwan while Russia and Ukraine is happening could potentially be catastrophic, because you'd be having multiple world powers trying to shift the balance of what they consider their countries and their identities, and the United States and the rest of Europe, and quite frankly our allies, would have to decide and make some choices about what we're willing to stand for and what we can actually sustain. So that could be potentially a very big story and something very key to watch. So thank you so much for keeping us honest on that, and I'll share what I can with you about it. Great question about whether or not the Russians are still protesting. Over the last several days, we have seen pictures from Moscow and other places that Russian protests are ongoing. But you're being arrested. I mean, you're able to protest for a moment, and then you are being arrested. There are those that apparently have challenged what's happening in Ukraine. And one of the things that is interesting about Vladimir Putin is that he allows a certain amount of criticism, because they want to give the idea, according to my reporting, of being a free society, a better society than the United States, for example. So they want to give the impression that there is more freedom than maybe there actually is. So protests are really, really key to pay attention to, because we know how the pressure of the people can lead to change. We saw that in Ukraine in 2014. You had the Ukrainians come into the streets and say, this is a corrupt government, too close of ties to Russia. We want a new European nation and a new future for Ukraine. They overthrew the Russian-placed government in Ukraine. And that's what really is part of the domino effect that we are to this day. So is there a vulnerability to Vladimir Putin? The answer would be yes here. Yes. How that affects how dangerous this situation is also part of the equation. Because if a leader feels more vulnerable and more pressure even for their own people, that could lead to different calculations. It is very critical to watch what's happening inside Russia. And even though we maybe haven't seen a huge outpouring, of hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, we have to remember the information is limited, number one. Number two, there's a consequence to the protests. And number three, it's also, the Russians have protested repeatedly over the last, well, we could say decades, but last several years, there's been different moments when Russians have tried in different ways to rise up against the decisions of Vladimir Putin and have been unsuccessful. But it doesn't take, it only takes that one thing, right? That one light, that one ignition, that one catalyst that then moves to something else. And so Vladimir Putin does have to answer to his people. He also has to answer to his inner circle. And so one of the other questions is, how is the inner circle looking at this battle? If this momentum that Russia's gaining in the South and the East continues, that's something that we're going to see as a momentum build. And momentum is very key, as we know that. Any other questions before we go? Melissa's asking about whether or not Vladimir Putin will resort to nuclear weapons. Obviously, that's been a big topic of conversation. What did Vladimir Putin do? This is where language really matters. He put basically his military on a heightened posture when it comes to nuclear weapons. The direct translation would be really important here, right? Because what exactly did he say? And what was the tone? Like, really understanding that is critical. One of the things the Pentagon did yesterday is they announced that they weren't going to do an intercontinental ballistic missile test because they were worried that it could be misconstrued. And they said they wanted to be responsible and show, we're not going to do missile testing because it could be looked at as provocative action, and we're going to be responsible. Well, there are those that are pushing back on the Pentagon and saying, actually, you're afraid to do that test because Vladimir Putin can use that test as an excuse to fire back, not necessarily at us, but then to ratchet up the sort of weaponry and the attacks on Ukraine. And so that's something that the Pentagon did. I think it's really scary, obviously, to talk about nuclear war. That's something that even 2 weeks ago wasn't on the forefront of our brain. What were we thinking about? Maybe the pandemic? I'll touch on that in just a second. We're not really talking about that at all. Everyone that I've talked to says the same thing about Vladimir Putin, which is that you just don't know. And this idea that, oh yeah, he's definitely not going to do that, he's definitely not going to resort to these sort of weapons, has been proven wrong. We go back time and time again, and you guys don't, I don't like talking about this story, but I think it's the only one that really hits home when you look at the equations of Vladimir Putin's thinking behind it. Russia shot down a passenger plane of innocent people that were flying over Ukraine. In 2014, there were more than a dozen children on that plane. They all died. And the world sort of sat back, And that gives you an idea of what the Russian regime is willing to do. There are those, it was an accident. We don't have to look at hypothetical situations. We actually just need to look at past behavior. And even though it's scary, that's why we need to be wide-eyed about it. So just want to mention that. I know it's not the happiest of thoughts, but I also think in trying to reassure the American people, you're getting a lot of the U.S. government. President Biden was asked about this. Is there going to be nuclear war? And he's like, no. Well, hopefully not. But the reality is that there's a lot of different directions that this story can go. And listen, if talks are happening between Russians and Ukrainians today, maybe there's still a chance for diplomacy. It doesn't look like there's a huge off-ramp for that. But you never know. And so that's one of the difficult things about covering this. And I know it's difficult to hear that there are so many variety of different storylines that are still on the table. So real quick here, one of the things you're going to see on our website is we're trying to compile, and this is a drastic shift. But we've talked about this over the last 2 years, which is that everybody has been under a lot of pressure. The pandemic has put everybody under a lot of pressure, economically, mentally, emotionally, physically. And that's been felt throughout the world. It's not just something in the United States. It's something that I felt, but also our world leaders have felt as well. And we've asked that question repeatedly. How has the pandemic sort of been a factor in foreign policy decisions even? Can we actually look at all these things as independent, or do the storylines cross over? And so one of the kind of fascinating things about this news cycle is sort of the lack of information about the pandemic suddenly. But what we're doing this week, and you'll see at the end of this week, is that we're compiling the changes in pandemic policies in the United States, and there are a lot of them. So in places where you saw mask mandates, you're no longer seeing them. Places you saw vaccine mandates, they're going away. And it's happening at a really rapid clip. The CDC recently changed how they're making their recommendations for masking. That happened late on the day on Friday. They have a new way to assess your risk in your community. But this is really, again, the world changes quickly. In the last 7 days, we have seen a massive change when it comes to policy. The CDC will say infection is lower. That's what they'll say. And so the question is now, what's next? Really what's next when it comes to the pandemic. So without going into too much detail on all of them, you'll see we're going to put quotes down from different states, and we're going to talk about some of the mandates that we're seeing go away. The reason why we watch places like New York City, America's largest city, or places like LA, is because what happens and what's modeled in these larger cities sometimes is repeated in your local community. So I think it's important to be aware of. Never mind just wanting to travel. So, anyways, I know at this point it's a lot of information. You guys are really doing a good job of keeping up. I did receive a smarter tip from Kara. I'd like to share, and maybe this needs to be a regular thing, that when you guys send in smart things to like make us live smarter and just be smarter, I'm going to share them. But I mentioned that my coffee just sits around, like I find empty coffee cups. No, I'm sorry. They're not empty at all. They're actually full. I'm a coffee waster and abuser. I just want to be honest with you. That's my confession. So I find these coffee cups all around my house, and they're useless. And apparently Kara uses a candle warmer. Did you know these things exist? A candle warmer to keep her coffee cup? I know there's ones for coffee. First of all, I didn't know about a candle warmer. Second of all, I have no idea about the fire hazard in this. And you got a lot going on. I don't think you need that in your life at all. But if it works, it might be the best tip that we've all ever heard. So we keep our coffee warm, get our candles kind of like, so everything's kind of burning and in a good way. So anyways, any final questions? If you're with us live, I'd love to know any final questions we can answer for you today. I'm going to be keeping up very closely, and you guys know what we're looking for now. We're looking for headlines about any other additional fallen city. Anything like that you see, just be aware of it. Words of warning. The New York Times was very out in front of this reporting. And maybe they got lucky and they had it confirmed, but I would say it's going to take a while to confirm some of these cities falling. So if you do see that, it's really going to be significant, but also we have to be very careful about how much we share about that. That's what we're going to be watching. We're also going to be watching about any sort of sustainability on both sides. Now we're not just in the adrenaline rush of this war that's taking place. We're now in a prolonged battle. And some of the very basic things that we all need on a regular basis are going to be a factor in what we're going to see next. So that's what I think is the most important thing to watch. All right. Great question. Just a final one, because again, this could be something that you see. Jean, thanks so much for asking this. What does it mean when people are asking to close the air? Great question. Again, one more thing to watch. There's been a request by the Ukrainians to close the airspace over Ukraine. The reason for that is because Russian jets, helicopters, are being used to bomb the people. And so if you close the airspace, that means no one's supposed to fly. The issue is that someone has to enforce that. And the White House has been very clear about that. If we say we're going to close Ukrainian airspace, that means we have to enforce that. Or whoever is saying that, if the Europeans, all of us, we need to enforce it, which means if we see a Russian fighter jet over Kyiv, we're going to have to try to deter that fighter jet. Do we need to shoot that fighter jet down? What does that mean? And the White House has pushed back and said, that would mean that the United States is in direct combat with Russia. That's something nobody wants to see right now. But it's going to become harder because as we see more and more images of these horrible images of civilians being targeted, that is part of a very difficult conversation and debate, not only when it comes to policy, but simple, humanitarian. You're on the sidelines watching someone be injured or killed, knowing that you may have the capacity to help. When do you step in and when do you don't? We've all had those situations in our life when we've witnessed something like that. There's obviously a lot of high-level considerations when the United States is trying to make that determination. If you saw anything about movement on a no-fly zone in Ukraine, that would be huge news. Right now, it doesn't look like that's the case. But in the meantime, that means the people of Ukraine are going to continue to be attacked from the air. And they don't have the sort of defense that other countries do. So it's a very key vulnerability for the Ukrainians. And it could be the difference here. It definitely is a difference here. So again, a very tough topic to talk about, but an important one to kind of understand about and very solid sort of, it's almost like a kaleidoscope, you could turn and look at that story from different angles and say, well, I would get in no matter what. I would help people no matter what. How could we stand by? Then you could click it and say, well, what if that means that the United States is drawn into a full-fledged war? What does that mean? What do we start, what are the ramifications of this? It's tough, very tough. And I think that's an understatement. There are times that words just don't seem to do justice. So we're doing the best we can, and we're going to tell the story as it develops. And that's all we can do right now. So thank you again for all your support of Smarter News. And for those of you that are new, and those of you who are not will laugh at me, because every time I'm like, we're about quick, concise, nonpartisan information, and then 45 minutes later, I'm still talking to you. You'll know that that's not typical, but this is a very big topic. It deserves a little bit more time, and I appreciate you all very much. And continue to, stay close with your questions. They're fuel for us to make sure that we're serving you the best that we can during a very critical moment in history. So thank you again for all of that and your support and your love. We feel it. We appreciate it. And we really value you. So thank you so much for that. Questions and comments, let me know. Always more on smarternews.com. And have a great day wherever you are. I'll talk to you soon.